If you'd gone to school 100 years ago, it would have looked a lot like this. Neat, orderly rows of desks with students receiving instruction from a teacher standing up front. My father went to a school like this. I went to a school that looked like this. And that was okay 100 years ago, because if you went to work looked a lot like school with the neat, orderly rows of desks, but now you had a supervisor telling you what to do, and you had workers instead of students listening to the instructions. So 100 years ago, the schools truly did prepare their students for the workplace. Workers were wanted that could sit still, follow directions, and do what they were told for long stretches at a time, much like they were trained to do in school. Fast forward to today, and the schools look pretty similar to what they did 100 years ago. In fact, somebody from 100 years ago walking into a school today would probably recognize it right away, and it wouldn't look that unfamiliar to them. Students in neat, orderly rows of desks, sitting, taking instructions from a teacher standing up front. But the work of today looks a lot different than the work of 100 years ago. However, the workplace of today looks a lot different than the workplace of 100 years ago. And not only does it look different, the workers that inhabit it are expected to do many different things, and the tools they're using are much different too. How different? We'll take a look at this. According to Nielsen, people spent 34 hours and 17 minutes using the internet on their mobile phone. And that's not just a mobile device, it's their phone. And that's up 9 hours and 52 minutes from the previous year. Whereas desktop usage went down an hour and 54 minutes from the previous year. So finally, people using the internet on a mobile device surpassed the number of hours that they use the internet on a desktop device. People don't sit still and do anything anymore. So what does that mean for the schools and the workplace of the future? What can the schools of today do to prepare people for the workplace of today? Well, obviously, we can't predict the future, just like the people of 100 years ago couldn't predict what schools and work would be like today. But here are some principles that the schools of today and the future can keep in mind. There are no sacred cows. That means we shouldn't do things today just because we did them 100 years ago or even 5 or 10 years ago. Now, we don't really know what the future is going to look like, so we can't really predict, but we shouldn't do something just because we've always done it. So, for example, let's take a look at algebra. We've been teaching algebra for centuries, and students for centuries have been asking, when am I ever going to use algebra in my everyday life? And teachers have a stock answer that they give. In fact, they've probably given it so much that they've maybe even stopped thinking, why do we teach algebra? In today's world, where coding is becoming so important, wouldn't it make more sense to teach logic instead of algebra? Maybe, maybe not. But we shouldn't cling to our insistence that we teach algebra just because we've always done it that way. There's no one right way to teach everything. Here's 4 different ways a math problem can be solved. And not just what we teach, but how we teach. Is lecture the best? In some cases, maybe. Is hands-on the best? In some cases, maybe. But we should always look at things with a fresh eye and see, is there a better way to do it? There's not one best way to do anything. Technology is not the end game. It's a tool. Should we teach students to use tablets just because we think they need to know how to use tablets? Maybe. Will they need to know how to use tablets in 5 years? We don't know. 8 years ago, smartphones didn't exist. What is technology going to look like 8 years from now? We don't know. There's probably some new technology out there right now being invented that's going to change the way we think and work. We should teach students how to constructively use the tools that they have rather than teach them how to use one particular tool, because we don't know when the tools are going to change. So what can we use now and in the near future to help us educate students? Well, let's take a look at 2 technologies: educational games, otherwise known as gamification, and mobile apps. So referring back to the Nielsen statistics of mobile usage, why not reach people where they are? So first, let's take a look at mobile apps. So let's take a look at this app called Oxy. It's a music sequencer. So it allows me or my students to create a musical background, and I'll start it by clicking on it. So I can add a drum beat. So what I do is I click where it says bass drum, and you'll see those beats appear. So I'll put in some hi-hats, and I decide I don't like them, so I'll drag them up. Okay, so now I'll put in the hi-hats where I want them, and I've taken the others and dragged them up the snare. So now I can just drag the beats around and get them the way I want them. So I'll drag a few things, and it's starting to sound like I want, but I don't like the hi-hat. I still don't like that, so I'll drag a few more. So you do have to know a little bit about music. Okay, now it's starting to sound like I want. So there's the beat. And when I'm done, then I click on done. So there's my beat. Anytime I click on that pattern, it will play. But I can also do it with actual notes, not just drum sounds. So what I do is I click, open it up, and then I just touch where I want the note. And this is set up so all your notes will sound good. So you can just click randomly, drag things around until they get the way you want them to sound. The way I use this is for backgrounds when we're playing guitar, but students can use it too to make their own backgrounds or even make their complete song. So you just click on whichever part that you want to play. Not too complicated, and almost anybody can do it. So there's my beats that I've created. And you can create keyboards and melodies, but you get the idea. Here's another app I really like called the Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. So it's got all the sections of the orchestra. By clicking on it, you can hear them. So we're listening to the brass right now. But if I want to hear a specific instrument, I can click on the family, and then I can hear a specific instrument. And I use this in my class because it's got really good instrument samples for the students to listen to, or they can explore it themselves. So now we're listening to the strings. And then we'll listen to the woodwinds. But it's got a really good game that I like to use with my classes called the oral quiz. So what it does is it has the sections of the orchestra on level 1. So I play, it gives me a sample. And I have to decide, is that strings, woodwind, brass, or percussion? So I have the students write down their answers on whiteboards and show me. And it was actually the strings. Now the great thing about this is it gets progressively harder. So in the next one you hear single instruments, and they're from very different families, like a string, a brass, a percussion. And then in the next level after that, you hear 3 instruments that are a little more similar, like you might hear a low brass, and then a medium brass, and then a high brass. And so it gets more complicated as it goes along. The instruments sound more and more alike, so your discrimination has to get better and better. Since one of our standards that the students have to know is being able to tell instruments apart from sight and sound, this is one app and game that I use a lot in my classroom. In fact, we've been doing it a lot the last few weeks, and the students really enjoy it. So let's wrap this up. Here's my vision of some things some instructional designers for K-12 schools can keep in mind. So this is specific. Now keep in mind, these are for K-12 educational technologists designing for public schools. So I think that every K-12 educational technologist should spend at least 1 year in the classroom and not as an intern, in the classroom by themselves. Because knowing what students should do and how they should learn and knowing how a teacher should deliver it is totally different sitting in a lab than sitting in front of a class of 30 12-year-olds. So if you want to teach those 12-year-olds, you should at least spend a year with them, preferably more. Technology should be part of the curriculum, not the whole of it. Teachers in K-12 schools cannot always count on having the technology they need, and they can't always count on it being supported or working. So technology is a great component to have, but there always should be other ways to teach it. Remember, there's more than one way to teach anything. Technology is great, but if it doesn't work or you don't have it, how can you get the job done? So remember the people who designed computers and invented computers? They didn't grow up with computers. So just because you don't have a technology doesn't mean that you can't learn successfully. So the next thing is make apps cross-platform or at least platform agnostic. There are web apps that you can run from a mobile phone, and you don't really need any particular platform to run it with. So the more devices you can run things on, the better it is for the teachers. A lot of schools are now allowing students to bring their own devices, and your platform, if your software only runs on one device, it's not really going to be that useful to half of your population or maybe more than half of your population. So the next one, keep the feedback loop short and materials transparent. Today, as a teacher, we have to teach standardized tests that we're not allowed to see. We don't see the results until after the students leave. In fact, we're not even allowed to look at the tests as we're giving them, and we're not allowed to talk about it. So how can we train our students to do well on these tests if we don't know? So as a designer, you need to let your teachers, so they can let their students know what they should be learning, and they need to know everything about the curriculum that they're teaching. Also, you need to take suggestions because people in the classroom might have different needs of what you could anticipate that they'd need. So you need to be responsive to that and help them in their task to make students better students. So in the end, allow for end-user flexibility. If you have a rigid course of study where you go from point A to point B to point C, that's not always that helpful to a classroom teacher because students don't learn in the same way at the same speed. So if you have modules that can be put in when the teacher needs it, or at least changed a little bit so that they can modify it for their particular class, that will be really helpful. So, do I have this right? Who knows? The schools of the future, we don't know what they're going to be like. But here's some of my ideas on what I think they should look like.